Hello, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the SDG7 Pavilion at COP26. We are absolutely delighted to welcome you here this morning for a discussion on one of the fundamental issues of the energy transition. How fast can we scale renewables to meet the urgent need of power sector decarbonisation? And we have with us today an absolutely esteemed panel of speakers from the private sector, from development finance, and an audience of people in the pavilion ready and waiting to ask questions. My name is Rebecca Collier, and I'm the Director for Clean Energy at the European Climate Foundation. And we are a grant-giving foundation that supports organisations around the world to meet our energy goals. And we have commissioned analysis about the pipeline of renewable energy that could be ready in 2 years to deliver jobs as part of COVID stimulus and to deliver on some of the immediate energy crisis concerns that are besetting us at the moment. We looked at 47 countries and we looked at the GDP, jobs and CO2 benefits of that pipeline of renewables. We commissioned this research from Ernst & Young Parthenon, the think tank of EY, and we will be hearing about some of those key results this morning. I feel it is absolutely timely, 6 years on from the Paris Agreement, to mark a turning point into transitions in the real economy at speed and at scale. 50% of all of the emissions that we need to reduce by 2030 come from the power sector, and particularly from those economies that are coal intensive. So we need to meet the twin goals of meeting renewable energy demand and also serving the access needs of communities around the world. And this is absolutely critical. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn you over to our speaker for today, the CEO of Climate Strategies and Partners, Peter Sweetman, who has been the board advisory member of this project and who's going to take you through some of the key results. So thank you, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. It's been a real privilege to work with you and with the teams from EY to set up this project. If I could show the presentation. So it's been a 2-year journey to get to this point, and as Rebecca said, EY has been helping us find a way to invest in a recovery which will generate a no-regrets alternative to delivering us the clean future and the sustainable energy and access for all that this discussion today and this pavilion represents. So if you could turn the next slide. So as Rebecca said, this project began across 6 continents, and what the question we had asked EY and its local teams to assess was identify for us generation, storage, distribution, transmission projects that were shovel ready, which meant that they would reach financial close within 2 to 3 years. Next slide. And so with that instruction and specifically looking into economies that needed to move beyond coal at a local level, they were able to identify a pipeline of 13,000 projects, which we refer to as no regrets renewable energy projects, which can accelerate the economic recovery. Next slide. There are 3 ways that we looked at that pipeline in terms of people, our planet, and prosperity. When calculating the number of jobs that would be available by over 3 years developing that pipeline, we identified 10 million jobs, of which roughly half are local in the building and construction phase of renewables, and the other half are in the strategic supply chains which produce the technologies. Once built, this pipeline will have a $60 billion recurring positive impact on GDP. countries which make the strategic supply chain investments to develop the manufacturing capabilities for those technologies will also be the ones which will capture more of those jobs as a greater supply as countries grow in terms of renewables penetration. Next slide. So we did a calculation to see how many gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent that pipeline, if built, would remove from the atmosphere. And the number is 2.5 gigatons annually. That is approximately half of the entire emissions of the United States, and that would be equivalent to 22% of the nationally defined contributions of the parties to the Paris Agreement who are meeting here at COP26 now. Next slide. Of course, that means an acceleration in the actual speed of development and finance of the renewables pipeline. We calculated that if built over the next 3 years, the investment funds required would be $654 billion a year. That would be 2.3 times the average rate of investment in renewables that has happened over the last 5 years. And that's still doesn't reach the WRI's estimate of 2.9 times that is required to meet our Paris trajectory. That, of course, is a step change in the speed of deployment of renewables in all of these countries, and that's actually just the tip of the iceberg. We don't think with 13,000 projects we've even scraped the surface of the projects that are potential. In Europe, we only think we identified 10% of the likely pipeline. Next slide, please. So in terms of prosperity, the 47 countries have lost economic output of $2.2 trillion as a result of the COVID crisis. But we've calculated that this pipeline in and of itself could build back 1.9 trillion of that. So in essence, just building renewables alone could bring us all the way back from the economic hit that the COVID pandemic has caused and deliver us 1 terawatt of new renewable generation capacity in those countries. Next slide, please. So we need some enablers for that. It's not just the amount of money that's required, but we also need a policy framework to match. Next slide. The enablers are shown here. There are 6. We need to have national targets which give a clear pathways, the proportion of renewables that each country wants to achieve over time. We need a regulatory framework and a policy framework underneath that provides the kinds of instruments like contracts for difference, like permitting and permissions that are required to deliver the renewables pipeline. We need domestic capital markets. That just means the availability of capital locally in the countries to co-invest with international capital markets, which is part of the money which is flowing from the north to south in the context of climate finance, as well as the development banks and the private banks that we have represented and talking to us here on our panel. Next slide, please. There's a great example right here. We're in the UK, so I thought I'd show you the example from Hull. So Hull has developed strategic supply chain for the offshore wind industry that's growing rapidly in the UK. 10% of the local gross value added was improved by that strategy, 13% improvement in local employment, 60% reduction in the unemployment benefit claimants in that region, and a 30% growth in local enterprises. Hull is a standout example of what happens when you strategically develop the supply chain for renewable energies. Next slide, please. It's not just about the strategic hubs, it's also about the multiplication effect of having the right policies and attracting international finance. In the UK, for every £1 of public money spent, 95 pounds worth of private sector money have been matched. And then moving to Argentina to take a developing world context, the multiplier there has been 10 times. Our point is, we don't think governments need to put in the money for this pipeline. We just need the governments to facilitate and enable their policy framework. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, and before we introduce the panel, I'd like to say that we've identified during this process that top priority, no regrets, post-COVID recovery pipeline of renewables projects. we believe there are some key policy enablers that need to be put in place, and countries can share that knowledge, and there's no one silver bullet solution, but now we're luckily we have an array of solutions that EY have reported in their substantial documentation. And finally, the international collaboration and cooperation which you here and all of us at this conference are working towards will be the way in which the public and private sectors come around and deliver that pipeline into a reality. So thank you for listening. That is the work that we came to share with you, and now I have the extreme pleasure in turning to our illustrious panel, who are joining me here at the stage in the SD7 Pavilion. And I think we'll start immediately here with you, Joyce. Joyce Lee is the Head of Policy and Projects for the Global Wind Energy Council. Joyce is a voice from the private sector on how this pipeline of renewable energy projects can increase in the emerging economies. So tell us, Joyce, how might that grow and face the affordability challenge?
So I think the first thing to recognize is that there is no shortage of available finance for renewable energy. In a recent IRENA study, they were looking at financing of renewables, and it found that some 86% of investment in renewables came from the private sector. That's across project finance from developers as well as commercial banks and institutions. And then when we look at the public sector finance, including multilateral development banks, which are often leading the charge in terms of funding renewables in emerging economies, they are too under increasing public pressure to decarbonize their portfolios and ensure that their assets are Paris compliant. In the wind sector, for both large-scale onshore and offshore wind, we face very heated bid rooms and high competition to finance projects. So let's be clear about one thing, that the challenge is not the availability of finance, but to meet our global net zero goals, we need wind growth on an annual basis to scale up by 4 times to quadruple within this decade. And to get there, that means we need ambitious governments and we need general public support. But in the wind sector, we still face challenges in regions like the Asia Pacific. We have offshore wind, high-level targets, but still challenges like the commercial fishing industry not being entirely aligned with offshore wind expansion, or just a lack of clear procurement mechanisms, a lack of clear regulatory frameworks. So what needs to happen is to ensure that we're effectively translating this financing and investment opportunity into benefits which are compelling for governments and to the general public. The more we can talk about what wind and renewable energy means for societies, and that's economic growth, it's jobs, it's what's in the EY report that you just mentioned, it's cleaner air, which translates into public cost, health cost savings, it's lower water consumption, which is often not spoken about very widely when we talk about renewables, but it's lower water consumption, which would be otherwise used for thermal generation. It's revitalization of coastal communities, it's upgrading national critical infrastructure, and so on and so on. So these are the kinds of positive externalities that are much more effective in building political support for initiatives on green recovery than when the sector goes around to talking about gigawatts or capacity factors. And I think it's no longer even sufficient to talk about these benefits on a project-by-project basis. 13,000 projects around the world means society-wide transformation writ large, and that's what policymakers need to recognize. But how do we get there? One of the key critical barriers is policy and regulation. The investment is there, but we need things like clear permitting and regulation schemes. Going back to the Asia-Pacific region as an example, in Vietnam, for instance, permitting for an onshore wind project is incredibly complex. You need dozens of approvals and consents from national ministries, provincial people's committees, as well as local authorities. In Thailand and the Philippines, we've had onshore wind growth also stagnate because there's no certainty around purchase prices for electricity, and just a lack of clarity on where procurement mechanisms like feed-in tariffs or auctions are heading. So the more that policymakers can provide these clear market signals to investors who are ready and waiting, that's how we can unlock investment in renewable energy.
Thank you so much, Joyce. Benigno, thank you for joining us. I know you were caught, like most of us, in the queue getting in, so a pleasure to have you here with us. You're Vice President of the IADB, the Inter-American Development Bank, and you obviously have been working with private banks in the Latin American region. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit about that and a little bit about how you see the opportunity for renewable power there.
Okay, thank you. Good day to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here on behalf of the IDB. And as you said, we were talking with private banks, and we see as a good signal that there is an opportunity there. Banks are eager to run into this business. They see an opportunity to help the fight against the climate effect that we are facing today in the region. And we have to work with them in order to, as the IDB, which is a leader in the region on climate change attitude, we can help them in order to help the countries to see this as an opportunity as well. As a multilateral institution that belongs to countries, and we are owned by countries, so we also depend on the demand of the countries. The good news there is that in the last meeting that we have in Barranquilla, there was a lot of requests from the governors in order for us to be more aggressive on climate change. And we are working with the governors, and we are working as well with the private in order to find solutions to this. One of these is the regulation, so we have to adapt the regulation in order for them to be more, to make the business for them more attractive. And we are also working with the governor. We have set up a platform of Minister of Finance. We believe that if you don't put this issue in the agenda of the Minister of Finance, it's going to be very difficult for the countries to go forward. So the good news there too is that we have a platform that is working very well. And hopefully we'll be having more of these opportunities in the future. We are talking with many of the private banks, and there presents many of the ideas to move forward in this aspect. So the short answer will be that the private sector is willing and eager to jump into this, and we have to set up the stage with a proper regulation and proper incentive for them.
Thank you, Benigno. We have joining us Upendra Tripathi. Upendra, can you hear me? Are you joining us from Delhi? Can you hear us?
Hi, yes.
Great.
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
So Upendra was the Secretary to the Government of India in the Ministry of New Renewable Energy, and he was the Founding Director General of the International Solar Alliance. So Upendra, perhaps you can tell us how solar is developing in India and your vision of how it can accelerate, given the headquarters of your International Solar Alliance is there in Delhi.
Thank you, and good evening from 6,875 kilometers, and that is the distance between Glasgow and Delhi. I must first congratulate you for the brilliant presentation. In fact, my job has become easier. I can just tell you a real-time thing. In 2015, when the solar journey of India started with an impetus, and I was the Vice Minister, I handed over a brief note to the Prime Minister Modi. In one side of the page, I wrote in megawatt, and in the other side, I mentioned gigawatt. So the Prime Minister asked me, why in one page you wrote megawatt and why in one page you wrote gigawatt? A typical bureaucrat. I said, it is a mistake. He said, no, it is not a mistake. It is, we are transiting in the mind from megawatt to gigawatt. And this is the romantic journey that India had since 2015. In 2015, we had a target of 20 gigawatts. And when India announced 100 gigawatt of solar, the world was taken aback. They said it's ambitious. And today, 46.3 gigawatt they have installed, 34 gigawatt they have at various stages of installation, 23.87 gigawatt in the tendering process. And yes, COVID was a big problem, because if you look at 2020, the investment in solar came down in India by 49%, unlike some of the countries like USA. And if you look at the sectors, the brilliant idea that Solar Park India brought in, which was very industry friendly, investment friendly, because land, labor, capital, and technology were put in the package. And Rooftop has been rather little slow, but off-grid is picking up. And why I'm talking about solar parks, rooftop, and even if we talk it off-grid, solar lanterns, home lighting systems, which actually address the issues of the society, of the community, street lights, agricultural solar pumps, some 2.7 million pumps the government of India have announced, and even solar cookers. But if you look at the institutional aspects of what solar revolution brought in India, Ministry of New and Renewable Energy was of course one of the oldest ministries, but a Solar Energy Corporation of India came up, all run with solar to promote solar parks. A whole public sector corporation came up. The financing agency, IREDA, the National Institute of Solar Energy, the National Institute of Wind Energy, the regulatory commissions, provincial regulatory commissions, and provinces play a very critical role. In fact, I speak from a province called Odisha, where in '99 they lost some 10,000 people in cyclone, and today, whenever cyclone comes, and they come quite frequently, it is zero. The type of resilience they have developed and the type of adaptation for solar mechanisms they have made, whenever a cyclone comes, the rooftop units are backed up and kept safely, and to be re-put after the cyclone goes. And in India also, as a part of the solar story, the Indian Solar Alliance is headquartered. There was a proposal of a World Solar Bank and Coalition for Disaster Resilience Infrastructure, which has become another international organization here. So to say that it is not only ideas that came in the solar revolution that we're talking about, new institutions cropped up, and actor, of course, the Prime Minister, many chief ministers, including the province that I mentioned, Odisha. You will find so many dedicated people for renewable energy, and that is the story India keeps on telling, that this is the duty of everybody to keep that globe safe. And I would like to say that the whole solar revolution in India is based on industrial support. It is mutual, very inclusive. And India, of course, provides 3 Ds, the democracy, the demography, and the demand. And given that India's per capita consumption of electricity is 1/3 of the global and 1/6 of that of China, maybe 1/12 of that of 1/18 of that of USA, it provides a bigger market for growth. And the expanding middle class, of course, will need more. And that is why, when India announced that by 2017 it's going to be net zero, promote net zero emission, and enhance its renewable energy to 500 gigawatt. And that is a dream, and that is going to provide the push the next future of solar in India. So it's actually a thrilling news, not only to talk about the sun in India, where 300 days in the year it smiles, and it is so, it doesn't, the supply never runs out, the prices never vary, the sun is free. And they say sunlight is oil in the air in India, because we import around 80% of our oil, petroleum products. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Upendra, and I join you in welcoming yesterday's announcement by your Prime Minister of that net zero target, and I'm so pleased that you're able to accelerate the deployment of solar through your alliance as a result of that. So turning to Africa, we're joined by Bright Natare, who is the head of business development for Fonewa, which is a leading fund in Rwanda. And Rwanda is a country which has been developing renewable energy faster than many African countries. And I was wondering, what can we learn from the Rwandan experience, and also what can we learn from Fonewa, Bright?
Thank you very much. I believe it's actually an advantage speaking last, because I agree with what everyone said. So the challenge here is actually not financing, but rather from an LDC's point of view, having the right leadership in place. So this leadership definitely translates into policy and strategy that's citizen-centric. So what has happened in Rwanda is, just from experience, we've learned that the private sector is there, they're ready to invest, but you have to put certain things in place, like a regulatory framework. You have to clearly demarcate and provide maps in terms of your on-grid and off-grid solutions. What we've done is actually even put in place a one-stop center, which makes registration of a business, permitting, and all that easier. So currently we're actually at around 68% access, and we have a target of 100% by 2024. 100% was the target for 2020, and we're actually producing more energy than we can consume currently. So what's the main challenge here? Challenge is, extending the grid, which is basically supported through the public sector. And there has to be a strong push towards that, creating the right environment for the private sector to invest. Currently, I would say we've actually even stopped permitting, because you don't want generation if you're not putting transmission lines in place. So the government is working with different partners to ensure that at least we've increased this access. The other thing that's really important is providing some incentives. So from a fund's point of view, there's a certain market segment. You mentioned that it's important to actually have, domestic finance in addition to international finance. However, when you look at commercial banks in LDCs, there are certain projects that they consider risky. So anything under 2 megawatts, they're not willing to invest in. So what we're doing as a fund is basically through public finance, coming up with financial instruments that reduce interest, and we provide subsidized loans to make these projects bankable. So we've entered into the market and tried to support those projects that wouldn't go to a bank and get financing, and these are usually rural off-grid projects, and if you have the target of meeting 100% connectivity, with most of the population in rural areas, focus should shift from on-grid to off-grid. So I believe that's one area as a fund we've been supporting the private sector to basically reach that market segment that's not targeted by the big players. That's what we're doing as a fund. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're on time. Please prepare questions. We're going to, among the panel, I have a question each, but as we do, I will introduce anyone who'd like to ask a question just after the first round. So if you'll hold your fire. But Joyce, just coming back to you. We just heard that it's not just the regulatory infrastructure, but it's the physical infrastructure that's necessary. You gave a good example of Vietnam in your earlier words. I was wondering if affordability is another issue that you'd mentioned, but in particularly Southeast Asia and Asian countries, whether you perceive that's a blockage, and if so, how do we get over that?
Thanks, Peter. Picking up on what my fellow panelist Bright mentioned, there are certainly some countries, LDCs or least developed countries in particular, where the economics of renewables are challenged by a lack of available infrastructure, lack of grid, or lower energy access issues as well, which you mentioned earlier. But I would point to data from Bloomberg NEF as well as Carbon Tracker Initiative, which has shown that in countries that cover 2/3 of the global population, wind and solar energy are already by far the cheapest sources of new electricity generation already. And within a few years, they'll be the cheapest sources of generation even compared to operating existing conventional sector assets. And that 2/3 of the global population, that's covering countries that are major industrial nations, big developing nations with sizable emissions footprints, including G20 countries like Brazil, Mexico, India, as well as South Africa. And I think it's particularly compelling on the green recovery topic because this is precisely the group of countries that have faced economic drag from COVID-19 and are still facing economic drag. And this is when they need to listen to the economics of the energy transition. There is no reason to keep investing in risky assets which could become stranded, in polluting generation that will be built to last for 30 or 40 years to come, in further exposing countries to volatile commodity prices. And we're seeing that currently play out with the dynamic of skyrocketing gas prices around the world. This is not the private sector coming to COP26.
Really critical is government providing high subsidies because you have most of your population living under the poverty line, But again, you have these targets of extending the grid to them to basically build their resilience to effects of climate change. So diversifying from agriculture to other sources of income. So there's also been an element of cross-subsidization, whereby a higher level of income earners subsidize for the low-income earners. So the other thing that has happened is basically provide tax breaks for investors in this space. So in a nutshell, what I would say is that this is a sector, at least from an LDC, that requires strong leadership and involvement from the public sector, as well as providing the right environment for the private sector to invest.
Thank you. Upendra, thanks for rejoining us. Sorry about the connection trouble we just had, but tell us more about the government of India's programs to provide the kind of guarantees, soft loan facilities and incentives that drive the infrastructure to enable the local renewables projects, the solar projects in India that you're following.
Well, in fact, the way India gives a push to solar energy through a whole lot of fiscal and financial measures is tremendous. Earlier they had this tax holiday, concessional excise duty, accelerated depreciation. But more than that, in India you find the cost of capital was quite high. And it is still so, and that is where you can understand India's push for global climate finance, because the cost of financing the project is the costliest in India. But increasingly, the policies are emphasizing to bring in 4 areas. How to make land available easily, because solar projects do need land, and luckily the efficiency increase is bringing down the need for too much of land. Actually, per megawatt it is coming down from earlier 5 acres to somewhere around 4 now. And they built a whole green energy corridor, some 7,000 kilometers with the help of KfW from Germany. In fact, NRDC, the National Resource Defense Council, they brought a book on compliance of India, and found that because of a whole lot of policy push and all that, their compliance with their commitment in Paris was was right on track. And labor, of course, the government of India took a specific measure to train 57,000 solar mechanics so that this industry gets workforce. And capital, of course, they invited a lot of foreign investment through MNCs and fiscal and energy policy measures. Tariff announcements, transmission policies, as you correctly pointed out in your presentation. And moreover, the flood of technology that is coming up into the Indian market, like the global market. We're talking about bifacials now, flexible panels, storage technologies, e-vehicles, and newer type of energy efficient, cooling equipment, both for mobile and transport sector. And India is adding the National Action Plan. In fact, they've started an action plan for short-lived climate pollutants. So a whole lot of an ecosystem of bringing in land, labor, technology, and policies in place. And combined with policy reforms, the distribution of energy reforms, then promotion of open access, and even measures to enforce contracts very fast. And adoption, formation of those 2 international agencies I told, and particularly enabling provinces to play a bigger and more effective role in the energy transition has actually made the scene of India's journey into solar not only adventurous, but in my word, it's a little romantic also. People didn't believe it would happen, and it is happening.
Thank you so much, Upendra. We have 2 questions that I know here from the audience, and I'd like, as you ask a question, just introduce yourself to us, and if you direct it to a person on the panel or to the panel as a whole, please go ahead, sir.
Maybe to the whole panel. My introduction, I'm Vimal Mahendra. I'm based in New Delhi. I work out of Geneva for the IEC Thank you. Vimal Mahendru, IEC Ambassador. I work for the International Electrotechnical Commission in Geneva, although I'm based in New Delhi, and I've met Mr. Tripathi a few times there in New Delhi. My question is generally to all of you. I hear you talking about finance and innovation and funding, a lot of things, but nobody's talking about standards. Actually, electricity has to be safe as it is here for all of us here in UK. So why is it that we are not talking about safety, which comes through standards, and also taking technologies and the innovations we are talking about global?
Thank you. Why don't we pass? We'll take a few questions, so everybody start thinking about standards. Sir.
Hi there. My name is Chris Castro. I'm here representing the City of Orlando as our Director of Sustainability and Resilience. This is a great conversation. One thing that we're starting to think about in this transition is how to deal with long duration storage. We've been talking about generation, but if we're truly going to make this pivot in this transition, we need to make sure it's reliable, it's affordable, it's resilient, of course, right? So we're starting to tinker with green hydrogen as long-term duration storage, and I'm interested in your perspective about that technology and whether you see green hydrogen as we move forward as also a combustible technology for baseload generation as well.
Thank you. Does anybody else have a question? This is probably the only round that we have time for, so if you do have one, please put your hand up. Yes, sir, please. Do introduce yourself before you ask.
Thank you. My name is Leo Chi. I'm here with the Sonoma County in California, and I'm on the delegation with Global Council for Science and the Environment. I had a question for Joyce. I'm just curious about your perspective around building those wind facilities offshore in developed countries like the United States. I mean, I'm already hearing concern from constituents who are worried about possible projects that are hundreds of miles away. So I'm just thinking about the amount of automatic opposition that automatically happens when people hear about offshore projects. I mean, for everyone on the panel, I would be curious just how you're able to convince the public that sometimes the energy production needs to be a priority over other concerns.
Thank you so much. What we'll do to close, so we're going to invite Jake from NRDC to give us a summary, but before we do, I'm going to give each one of you 30 seconds, and I'm going to direct the questions we've heard at each one of you as we go along, and I'm going to start with Joyce, because you just heard the speaker asked a question to you. So perhaps, Joyce, you could give us the answer to that question and close.
Yeah, thank you for your question. We are hugely excited about the offshore wind targets that have been set in the U.S. That's across both fixed offshore winds for now, it's coming off the East Coast, as well as floating offshore wind, which is really going to take off the West Coast. I was a bit surprised to hear that the opposition is coming from the projects which are hundreds of miles away from communities, because it's actually more common, and this is the factor when we talk about NIMBYism in the renewable sector, that there's opposition from communities and having the large-scale projects on their doorstep or within sight. After 30 kilometers from when you're standing on the coastline, it's actually really difficult to even see the offshore wind farms in operation. But I would just go back to what's come out very strongly from every intervention here today, which is that renewable energy needs to be framed in a citizen-centric way, where we're translating these benefits into how many homes can they power with clean energy, how many jobs they can create, and offshore wind is particularly unique in this respect because it means creating jobs along coastlines, along coastal communities that are often facing economic difficulties, and it can really help to revitalize these kinds of areas, upgrading ports, bringing in advanced technology, and it's really sustainable jobs as well. Offshore wind farms operate for around 25 years on average, so when you have a job in operations and maintenance, that's a job for life.
Thank you. Benigno, I'm going to pick a piece of that question, which is green hydrogen, because I know that it's a subject that is talked about a lot at this conference and also you're focusing on. Is there anything about green hydrogen that should accelerate that pipeline of renewables in Latin America, in your opinion?
Well, what it is demand, a lot of demand for going into green hydrogen. And we are working with the countries for one side and with the private sector for the other side in trying to set up the perfect place to go. It's a I think that some countries are more advanced than others in order to go to move to the green hydrogen. But I think that what we believe is a place to go, but we have to do a lot more studies yet to that. But we believe that it can be a game changer in the future.
Thank you. Upendra, your colleague talked about safety and standards. Is that a question you could answer?
Yeah, in fact, yes, I remember my meeting, and it's very critical that standards and protocols are extremely important for the whole electricity sector. And given the example of India, that the Bureau of Energy Efficiency and the CEE, Central Electrical Authorities, and the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, they continuously improve it, and the international platforms have been very useful, because in most cases they adopt the standards from international level on various products. But so far as the solar realm is concerned, a lot more has to be done. And given the flexibility in the global market, panels moving, like for example, India imports around 90% of.
I'm afraid
And Taiwan, so it's not the standards are getting globalized. Standards are becoming it's more critical than ever that we both maintain standards, not only for the products but for also services. And it's correctly pointed out that in most countries it's taking a legal form, but a lot more has to be done. And this is where I think the international organizations like the UN bodies and all that, even the civil society sector has to play a very important role. It is not merely formulation of standards, but it's also making them aware, making citizens aware of the standards, and their applications to goods and services are very critical.
Thank you, Pendra. Thank you, Pendra. And just finally, Bright, one of the questions, Chris, I think, mentioned the aspects of resilience. He also mentioned the aspects of just transition, and you talked about adaptation. But I want to know, we refer to this pipeline as no regrets, and I think it adds more than just power, as you were saying. So would you like to perhaps answer to that and close?
Yeah, I believe it's imperative that for instance, when you're designing projects, it's imperative that you actually work with the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning. So what we've done is that whenever we're designing projects, we actually take into consideration O&M, so operation and maintenance over the years. But attached to that, we also look at livelihood. Talking about adaptation, you've extended the grid, but what are some of the livelihood activities that could actually benefit from having access, so the grid extended to a community? So that's always embedded within the projects we implement. We actually have a JEF project we're implementing currently, and it looks at last mile connectivity and using renewable energy as a source of livelihood. So people moving away from agriculture to things like carpentry, building markets for them, and basically trying to get most of your population from rain-fed agriculture, getting into mechanization, solar irrigation. But one other aspect I need to mention here around safety as well as standards. One challenge around actually the solar energy is the end life of batteries. Coming from an LDC, that's something we need to start thinking about and transitioning into that way. Thank you.
As do we all. So I appreciate all of the panelists. Thank you, Upendra. Thank you, Bright. Thank you, Benigno. Thank you, Joyce. And Jake, if you'd like to join us here and perhaps try and summarize or close.
I will. Oops, I just lost it on that. I will close in, I think, 1 minute. So let me just leave you with, I think, 3 sort of key pieces that I picked up today, and hopefully we can depart on that. One, whenever you hear that there's no renewable projects, tell people no. There's at least 13,000, and I can tell you, having looked at the study, there's places that just have solar and wind potential, geothermal potential, and they just haven't been sort of mapped out yet, and a project hasn't been put on the table. So there's clearly availability. The second piece I think is really important to understand is we need to have everybody kind of working together, because there's different pieces of the puzzle. So the development banks have a role, the export credit agencies have a role, the private sector has a role in terms of companies, the private financial institutions have a role, governments have a role, and I think it's really critical for them to all take a different piece, because they have a different sort of solution that they can help to provide to bring forward these pipeline of projects to reality. And then the third thing I think we should sort of lead folks with is you have to push. You're going to run into barriers along the way, but there's always solutions for them if you kind of keep focus on it and drive that transition that you sort of need. So what I hope is that we come back to a panel like this in 5 years and we ask these same panelists or maybe some others and we say, hey, how's the renewable sector sort of going? And they say, well, I'm kind of done because I have deployed all of the projects that are out there. And then the follow-up question is, well, isn't there some other opportunities? And they're like, no, we're done because we've got 100% renewables across all of the world and we're good. So that's our goal, and I hope that we leave this session, come back in maybe 5 years. I'll give you 10 years to do it. But that's our marching orders and our goal. So thank you very much for everyone for joining. Thank you to our great panelists, and stay tuned because there will be a lot more news on these fronts.